The room buzzed with anticipation as Aidan Turner adjusted his tie backstage. The soft hum of conversations beyond the curtains mixed with the occasional burst of laughter and applause from the ongoing presentations. The annual Boston Job Fair was more than just a networking event. It was a lifeline for many families, offering new opportunities and a chance to rebuild. For Aidan, it was also an opportunity to unveil his company's newest initiative, an employment program aimed at empowering underprivileged communities with technical skills and sustainable jobs. He smoothed his tailored suit and stole a glance at his assistant, Sophia Carter, who was busy typing on her tablet. "How many are in attendance today?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with the usual pre-presentation unease. "About 500, Sophia replied without looking up. "The keynote is packed. All eyes on you, boss." Aidan let out a small chuckle, though the weight of expectation pressed against his chest. Public speaking wasn't his favorite activity, but Turner Technologies' initiative was deeply personal to him. Over the years, he had poured his energy into creating opportunities for others, a cause fueled by the guilt of mistakes he could never undo. A stagehand gave the signal, and Aidan nodded. With a deep breath, he stepped out onto the stage to a round of polite applause. The bright stage lights warmed his face, momentarily blinding him as he approached the podium. He scanned the audience, a sea of eager young professionals, parents with hopeful eyes, and people searching for a fresh start. These were the faces that reminded him why this program mattered. "Good morning, everyone," Aidan began, his voice steady and polished. "It's an honor to stand here today among so many talented and hard-working individuals. At Turner Technologies, we believe in the transformative power of opportunity. It's not just about creating jobs, it's about rebuilding lives." As he spoke, the words flowed naturally, each line rehearsed to perfection. But then his gaze wandered over the crowd again, this time more deliberately. He tried to focus on the faces in front of him, their attentive expressions fueling his confidence. Then he saw her. In the third row, near the center aisle, a woman sat with a young boy beside her. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, styled in soft waves that framed her face. She wore a simple blazer over a floral dress, her posture calm but reserved. And those eyes, those piercing, familiar eyes, locked onto him with an intensity that sent his carefully constructed composure spiraling. Stella. Aidan's heart slammed against his ribs, his voice faltering for a split second. The microphone picked up the hesitation, and a ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. He recovered quickly, continuing his speech as though nothing had happened, but inside his thoughts were anything but steady. And then he saw the boy. The child, no older than 6, sat with one hand clutching Stella's. His messy dark hair and curious gaze made him stand out, but it was the striking familiarity of his features that tightened Aidan's chest. The boy's eyes mirrored his own, and the shape of his jawline left no room for doubt. Aidan Turner had never been a man to believe in fate, but in that moment he felt its cruel weight pressing down on him. Aidan tightened his grip on the edge of the podium, his knuckles whitening under the strain. His heart raced, and for the first time in years, he found himself grappling with an emotion he couldn't quite name: fear, guilt, or perhaps longing. The boy leaned closer to Stella, whispering something inaudible. She nodded, her expression softening briefly as she glanced down at him before quickly returning her guarded gaze to Aidan. His practiced words now felt hollow. The passion that usually carried his speeches had dissolved into a distant hum in his mind. He pressed on, delivering the remainder of his address with mechanical precision, his voice steady even as his thoughts swirled chaotically. And that is why we are committed to creating a future where opportunity is within everyone's reach. he concluded, forcing a small, professional smile. A smattering of applause followed, and Aidan stepped away from the podium with a grace that belied his inner turmoil. He barely heard the event organizer thanking him as he exited the stage, retreating to the green room where Sophia waited. "That was solid," she said, glancing up from her tablet. "I'd say an 8 out of 10. The pause halfway through added a bit of vulnerability. People eat that up." Aidan ignored her comment, pacing the room like a caged animal. His mind was locked on Stella and the boy, Otis. His instincts whispered. "She's here," he said, his voice low and strained. Sophia frowned, setting the tablet aside. "Who's here?" "Stella," Aidan muttered, running a hand through his neatly styled hair, disheveling it. "And there's a boy with her. He looks—" His words caught in his throat. "He looks like me, Sophia." Her professional demeanor faltered momentarily, replaced by genuine concern. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Aidan snapped, then softened his tone. "I know what I saw." Sophia stood, stepping closer. "What do you want to do? Should I find out if she's still here?" Aidan hesitated. The question twisted his gut. Did he want to see her? Did he want answers? The idea of confronting her was as terrifying as it was necessary. Yet he couldn't shake the memory of her expression, a mixture of resignation and defiance. She had known he was on that stage. She had known he would see her. And yet, she'd come anyway. "No," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet." Sophia nodded but didn't look convinced. She returned to her seat, leaving Aidan to wrestle with his thoughts. He collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands as the image of Stella and Otis replayed in his mind like a relentless loop. For years, Aidan had constructed his world around order and control, every move calculated and precise. But now, for the first time in years, his foundation felt fragile, as if one wrong move could shatter it completely. The distant hum of the job fair continued beyond the walls, a muffled reminder of the life Aidan had built, one defined by success, power, and ambition. Yet none of it seemed to matter anymore, not when faced with the unanswered questions that hung heavily in the air. Who was Otis? And what had Stella kept from him all these years? The conference hall had begun to empty, the energy of the event transitioning into a quieter hum as attendees drifted between booths or filtered out into the crisp Boston afternoon. Aidan Turner stood near the exit, his usually commanding presence subdued by the storm of emotions raging beneath the surface. His eyes scanned the thinning crowd, searching for the familiar figure that had disrupted his carefully constructed world. And then he saw her. Stella Hayes stood near a booth at the far end of the room, speaking with one of the company recruiters. Her expression was composed but distant, her hand resting protectively on the shoulder of the boy standing beside her. Otis clutched a toy robot, his small fingers moving idly over its metallic surface as his gaze wandered curiously around the room. Aidan's chest tightened at the sight of them together, a pang of something between regret and longing piercing through him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before starting toward them. Each step felt heavier than the last, his resolve wavering as 100 questions swirled in his mind. What would he say? How would she react? And most importantly, was he ready to face the answers he so desperately sought? When he was only a few feet away, Stella's eyes met his. Her body tensed visibly, her fingers curling slightly on Otis's shoulder. For a moment, neither of them moved, the distance between them charged with unspoken words and unresolved history. "Stella," Aidan said, his voice low but firm. She turned fully toward him, her expression guarded. "Aidan," she replied evenly, her tone giving nothing away. He glanced down at Otis, who was now looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. The boy's resemblance to Aidan was undeniable, and it made his throat tighten. Can we talk? Aidan said, his gaze shifting back to Stella. Stella hesitated, her hand tightening on Otis's shoulder. Now's not a good time, she said curtly. Please, Aidan pressed, his tone softening. Just for a moment. Otis tugged on Stella's sleeve. Mommy, who's this? He asked, his voice small but curious. Stella's jaw tightened, and she crouched slightly to meet her son's gaze. Just someone I used to know, sweetheart, she said gently, brushing a hand through his dark hair. She straightened, her eyes returning to Aidan with a sharper edge. It's been a long day, Aidan. We need to go. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Stella, please, I just need to know. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flickering with a mixture of anger and something deeper. Pain, perhaps. She sighed, then glanced around the room as if calculating her options. Fine, she said finally. 5 minutes, but not here. Without waiting for a response, Stella guided Otis toward a quieter corner near the building's exit. Aidan followed, his pulse quickening as he prepared for a conversation that had been years in the making. When they reached a quiet alcove near the exit, Stella turned to face Aidan, her arms crossing defensively over her chest. Otis stood close to her, holding her hand tightly, his wide eyes flicking between the two adults. Stella glanced down at him, her expression softening for a brief moment. Otis, she said gently, why don't you play with your robot over there for a minute? She gestured toward a nearby bench. I need to talk to Mr. Turner. Otis hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly, but he nodded. Okay, Mommy, he said, toddling off to the bench and settling in, his small fingers tinkering with the robot. As soon as he was out of earshot, Stella turned back to Aidan, her calm demeanor replaced by a quiet fury. What do you want, Aidan? She asked, her voice low but sharp. Why now? After all these years. Aidan took a breath, steadying himself. I didn't know you were here, he said, his voice earnest. I didn't know about him. Stella's eyes narrowed, her arms tightening around her torso. And what difference does that make now? You've built your empire, your life. Why drag us into it? I'm not here to drag anyone into anything, Aidan said, his tone firm but controlled. I just need to know the truth. Is he? He trailed off, his voice faltering as he glanced toward Otis, who was now engrossed in making his robot perform an awkward mechanical dance. Don't finish that sentence, Stella interrupted, her voice trembling with restrained emotion. You don't get to ask that, Aidan. Not after everything. Her words stung, but Aidan held his ground. I know I wasn't there, he said quietly. I know I messed up, but if he's my son— If? Stella cut him off, her eyes flashing with anger. She took a step closer, her voice lowering to a near hiss. You don't get to act like this is some kind of revelation. I did what I had to do, Aidan. You made your choice when you put your career above everything else, above me, above us. Aidan felt his chest tighten, her words slicing through him with the precision of a blade. I didn't know, Stella, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I didn't know you were pregnant. Because I didn't tell you, she snapped, her voice thick with emotion. Do you have any idea what it was like? To go through that alone? To watch you bury yourself in your work while we fell apart? He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in years, Aidan felt utterly powerless, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him like a tidal wave. He glanced toward Otis again, the boy's carefree laughter, a stark contrast to the tension crackling between them. Stella exhaled sharply, her shoulders slumping slightly as the anger in her expression gave way to exhaustion. He's mine, she said quietly, her voice softer now, but no less resolute. I raised him. I've been there for him every step of the way. You weren't." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Aidan nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to be there for him now. For both of you." Stella shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "It's not that simple, Aidan. You don't just show up and decide you want to be a father." "I'm not asking for simple," he said, meeting her gaze again. "I'm asking for a chance." Stella's expression flickered. Hesitation, doubt, and something else Aidan couldn't quite place. She glanced toward Otis, her protective instincts warring with the emotions written plainly across her face. "Mommy, look," Otis called, holding up his robot triumphantly. "It's doing the dance!" Stella smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. She turned back to Aidan, her voice measured but firm. "We'll see," she said, the words carrying both a warning and a glimmer of possibility. "But don't think for a second that I'll let you hurt him." With that, she stepped away, calling Otis to her side. Aidan watched as they walked toward the exit, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. Stella hadn't shut the door completely, but he knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. As they disappeared into the crowd, Aidan exhaled slowly, a renewed determination settling in his chest. He wasn't going to give up. Not this time. Aidan sat alone in his penthouse apartment, the glittering skyline of Boston stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city's lights twinkled against the night sky, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions churning within him. His glass of untouched scotch sat on the table, the amber liquid refracting the muted glow of the room's ambient lighting. For years, Aidan had prided himself on being unshakable, a man who could compartmentalize his emotions and focus solely on his goals. But tonight, his carefully constructed armor felt irreparably cracked. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as memories flooded in. Memories of Stella. He hadn't thought about their early days in years, but now they came rushing back, vivid and unrelenting. He could see her as clearly as if she were standing in front of him. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams, her quiet laugh that always seemed to soften his sharp edges, and the warmth she brought to every room she entered. They had met during a networking event in their late 20s, both ambitious in their own ways. Stella had been a teacher then, brimming with passion for education and her students. Aidan had been captivated by her unwavering belief in the power of people, a stark contrast to his own pragmatic worldview. They balanced each other. Her idealism tempered his ambition, and his drive grounded her dreams. Or at least, that's what he had believed. The early years of their marriage had been blissful. They had lived in a modest apartment, dreaming together about the future. Stella had always wanted children, and Aidan had assured her he did too, though now he realized his enthusiasm had been more theoretical than genuine. There had always been another meeting, another deal, another milestone that demanded his attention. When they finally decided to start a family, the months of hope quickly turned to years of heartbreak. Aidan clenched his fists at the memory of those late-night arguments, the words they couldn't take back, the way Stella's eyes had brimmed with tears as she accused him of running away from her, from their marriage, from the life they had promised to build together. And then there was the night she left, her suitcase by the door, her voice trembling as she said, "I can't do this anymore, Aidan. I need to find myself again, and I can't do that with you." He had watched her go, too proud and too angry to stop her. At the time, he had convinced himself she would come back, that they just needed space. But weeks turned into months, and the divorce papers arrived. Aidan had signed them without a fight, burying himself in work as a way to drown out the pain. He had told himself it was for the best, that he wasn't meant for the kind of life Stella wanted. Yet now, sitting here with the image of Otis's face etched into his mind, Aidan realized how deeply he had been lying to himself. The sound of his phone vibrating snapped him back to the present. He glanced at the screen. Sophia. For a moment he debated letting it ring, but then he sighed and picked it up. Yes? You're a mess, Sophia said bluntly, skipping any pleasantries. I've been your assistant long enough to know when something's eating you alive. Aidan ran a hand through his hair. It's Stella, he admitted. And her son. He's mine, Sophia. I know it. There was a pause on the other end, then a sigh. Are you sure? I mean, it's not exactly something you can just assume. I'm not assuming, Aidan said firmly. I saw him. He looks exactly like me, and she didn't deny it. Sophia hesitated. So, what's the plan? Aidan stared out the window, the city's lights blurring as his thoughts spiraled. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I can't just walk away. Sophia's voice softened on the other end of the line. Aidan, if you're serious about this, about being part of his life, you need to think this through. Stella's not going to make it easy for you, and honestly, I don't blame her. You need to prove to her and to that little boy that you're in this for the right reasons. Aidan exhaled slowly, her words settling heavily in his chest. I know, he said, but where do I even start? She barely let me talk to her earlier. Start small, Sophia suggested. Find a way to reach her without pushing too hard. If she's spent years raising Otis on her own, she's not going to trust you overnight. Show her you're serious. Actions, not words. Aidan nodded to himself, the clarity of Sophia's advice cutting through his emotional haze. You're right, he said. I'll figure it out. Good, Sophia replied. And Aidan? Don't screw this up. You don't get a second chance at something like this. As the call ended, Aidan sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling over him. He knew Sophia was right. This wasn't just about him anymore. If he wanted to be part of Otis's life, he needed to approach this with care, not with the single-minded determination he used in the boardroom. This was about family, something he had never truly understood until now. The next morning, Aidan arrived at the office earlier than usual, his mind already racing with plans. He worked methodically, sending off emails and reviewing documents, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Stella and Otis. By mid-afternoon, he couldn't ignore the pull any longer. He needed to take a step forward, even if it was small. After hours of deliberation, Aidan decided to reach out to Stella in a way that would catch her attention without overwhelming her. He pulled out his phone and began typing a message. Stella, I know I don't deserve much after the way things ended, but I want to make things right. Not for me, but for Otis. And for you, if you'll let me. I'd like to meet, just to talk. No expectations, no pressure. You name the time and place. Aidan. He read it over several times before hitting send, his heart pounding as he watched the message disappear into the ether. Now all he could do was wait. The hours stretched on, each minute longer than the last. Aidan tried to focus on work, but his phone seemed to mock him with its silence. By the time evening rolled around, he had resigned himself to the possibility that Stella might not respond at all. But then, just as he was about to leave the office, his phone buzzed. He snatched it up, his breath catching as he read the screen. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. Quincy Park. Don't be late. A small, hopeful smile tugged at the corners of Aidan's lips. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next day, Aidan arrived at the park 10 minutes early, scanning the area nervously. It was a quiet, leafy expanse tucked away from the bustling streets of Boston, the kind of place that invited reflection and solitude. Stella had chosen well. When she appeared, Otis in tow, Aidan felt his heart tighten. Stella wore a light cardigan over a simple dress, her face calm but unreadable. Otis clutched a soccer ball, his eyes lighting up when he spotted the open field nearby. "Mummy, can I play over there?" Otis asked, pointing toward a grassy patch. Stella glanced at Aidan briefly before nodding. "Stay where I can see you," she said. As Otis ran off, Aidan turned to Stella, his voice soft. "Thank you for meeting me." She regarded him coolly, her arms crossing over her chest. "You have 5 minutes. Make them count." Aidan swallowed hard, steeling himself. "I'm not here to make excuses or to dig up the past," he began. I want to be part of his life. Whatever it takes, I'm willing to do it." Stella raised an eyebrow, skepticism flashing in her eyes. "Why now, Aidan?" "After all this time, what's changed?" "You're right," he admitted. "I wasn't there when I should have been, and I can't change that. But I saw him, Stella. I saw Otis, and I felt it. He's my son, and I can't walk away from that." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally she sighed, glancing toward Otis, who was now happily kicking the ball around. "He's not just your son, Aidan," she said quietly. "He's a little boy who needs stability, love, and consistency. Can you give him that, or are you just here because you feel guilty?" Her words stung, but Aidan met her gaze steadily. "I'm here because he deserves to know me," he said, "and because I want to know him. I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I'll do whatever it takes to prove I'm serious." Stella's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze softening slightly. "We'll see," she said at last, her voice measured. "But for now, don't make any promises you can't keep. He's been let down enough." Aidan nodded, relief and determination swelling in his chest. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. As Stella called Otis back and they walked away together, Aidan stayed rooted to the spot, watching them disappear into the park's tree-lined paths. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't dared to hope for: a chance. Aidan sat in his office, staring blankly at the city skyline as the midday sun reflected off the glass buildings. He had spent the better part of the morning trying to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting back to the brief but charged meeting with Stella the day before. Her words echoed in his mind. "He's a little boy who needs stability, love, and consistency. Can you give him that?" He sighed and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Stella's skepticism wasn't unwarranted. He had spent years burying himself in his career, using work as a shield against the wounds of his past. Now, confronted with the possibility of being a father, he was forced to re-evaluate everything he thought he knew about himself. The sharp knock at his office door snapped him out of his thoughts. "Come in," he called, straightening his posture. Sophia entered, a folder tucked under her arm. She gave him a knowing look as she closed the door behind her. "You look like you haven't slept," she said, dropping the folder onto his desk. "I haven't," Aidan admitted. He gestured toward the folder. "What's that?" "Everything you asked for," Sophia replied, settling into the chair across from him. "I looked into Stella's life over the past few years. She's been through a lot." Aidan hesitated before reaching for the folder, his fingers brushing against the edge. "I didn't ask for this to invade her privacy," he said quietly. I need to understand." Sophia nodded. "I know, and I made sure to keep it professional. Most of what I found is public record: her teaching career, the books she's published, the places she's lived. But it's clear she's been doing everything on her own since the divorce." Aidan flipped open the folder, scanning the documents inside. There were records of Stella's modest income as a freelance writer, articles about the children's books she had authored, and a rental agreement for a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. His chest tightened as he read about the financial struggles she had faced, including a debt she had recently cleared, likely from medical expenses, though the details weren't included. "She's done well with what she has," Sophia continued. "Otis seems to be thriving. He's enrolled in a good school, participates in after-school activities. She's doing everything she can for him. Aidan closed the folder, guilt settling over him like a heavy blanket. While he had been building his empire, Stella had been carrying the weight of parenthood alone. He thought back to the hopeful look in Otis's eyes when they met at the park. The boy deserved more. He deserved Aidan to step up. "What do I do with this?" Aidan asked, his voice thick with emotion. "How do I make things right?" Sophia leaned forward, her expression softening. "You start by listening. Show her that you're not here to take over, but to support. Let her know you're willing to put in the work to be part of Otis's life." Aidan nodded, her words giving him a sense of direction. "She deserves more than what I gave her before," he said quietly. "And so does he." The next morning, Aidan found himself parked outside Stella's apartment complex, gripping the steering wheel as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded. He had spent the night preparing what he wanted to say, but now, sitting here, every carefully rehearsed sentence felt inadequate. He glanced at the small box on the passenger seat, a gift for Otis. It wasn't extravagant, just a robotics kit Aidan thought he might enjoy, a subtle way to bridge their shared love for technology. Finally, he exhaled and stepped out of the car. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he approached the building. Stella's apartment was modest but inviting, with pots of blooming flowers lining the small balcony. He hesitated at the door before knocking, his heart pounding in anticipation. After a moment, the door opened, revealing Stella. She looked surprised to see him, her brows knitting together in a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "Aidan," she said, her tone wary. "What are you doing here?" "I'm not here to intrude," he said quickly, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. I wanted to see if we could talk, and I brought something for Otis." He motioned to the box in his hand. Her eyes flicked to the box and back to him, her expression softening just a fraction. "He's at school," she said, her voice guarded, "and I don't think now is a good time." "Please," Aidan said, his voice tinged with earnestness. "I'm not trying to push my way in. I just want to understand what you've been through and how I can help." Stella studied him for a long moment, her fingers tightening on the edge of the door. Finally, she stepped aside. "5 minutes," she said, motioning for him to come in. The apartment was small but cozy, with bookshelves lining the walls and bright artwork that Aidan guessed belonged to Otis. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, calming yet bittersweet. Aidan set the box down on a side table, unsure of what to do with his hands as he took in the space. "Say what you need to say," Stella said, crossing her arms as she leaned against the kitchen counter. Aidan turned to face her, his expression serious. "I know I wasn't there for you," he began, his voice steady but laced with regret. "I wasn't there for either of you, and I can't undo that. But I want to be here now, for Otis, and for you, if you'll let me." Stella's eyes narrowed slightly. "You say that now, but what happens when it gets hard? When Otis asks questions you can't answer, or when he gets attached and you're too busy to follow through?" "I can't let him get hurt, Aidan. Not again." "I won't let him down," Aidan said firmly. "I know I've made mistakes, more than I can count. But I'm not the same person I was back then. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to earn your trust and his." Stella sighed, her gaze softening slightly as she looked down at the floor. "It's not that simple," she said quietly. "You can't just walk in and expect everything to be okay. It's going to take time." "I understand that," Aidan said, his voice gentle but resolute. "I'm willing to wait. However long it takes, I'm here." For a moment, the room was filled with silence, the weight of their shared history hanging heavily between them. Finally, Stella nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "If you're serious about this, you'll need to prove it. To me and to Otis." "I will," Aidan promised, his voice unwavering. Stella's gaze lingered on him, a mixture of hope and uncertainty in her eyes. "We'll see," she said, her tone cautious but not dismissive. "But if you let him down, Aidan, there won't be a second chance." "I won't," he said quietly, the conviction in his voice undeniable. As Aidan left the apartment, a sense of purpose settled over him. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time in years he felt certain about one thing: he wasn't going to fail Otis or Stella again. Aidan stepped out of his car, taking a deep breath of the crisp autumn air as he approached the small soccer field where Otis's after-school practice was underway. A group of children, their bright jerseys contrasting with the green of the field, darted back and forth as they chased the ball. Among them, Aidan spotted Otis almost immediately. The boy's energy was infectious, his movements swift and focused as he navigated the field with surprising skill for his age. Aidan had debated for hours about whether showing up unannounced was the right decision. He had promised Stella he would tread carefully, but his desire to see Otis again had won out. Standing there on the sidelines, he felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, an overwhelming mix of pride and apprehension. As the practice continued, Aidan stayed at a respectful distance, observing quietly. He didn't want to draw attention or disrupt Otis's routine. For the first time in years, Aidan felt like an outsider looking in on a life he didn't yet belong to, and it stung. But he also knew this was just the beginning of the journey. The shrill sound of a whistle broke through his thoughts, signaling the end of practice. The children began to disperse, some running toward waiting parents, while others huddled around their coach. Otis lingered on the field, his head bent as he worked to tie his cleats. Aidan hesitated before stepping closer. "Otis," he called gently, careful not to startle him. The boy looked up, his brow furrowing slightly, before recognition dawned in his eyes. "Mr. Turner," Otis said, standing upright. He seemed unsure of how to react, his small hands fidgeting with the laces of his cleats. "You can call me Aidan," he said with a smile, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "I hope it's okay that I stopped by. I wanted to see you play." Otis's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You watched me?" "I did," Aidan said warmly. "You're pretty good out there? Fast, too. I don't think I could have kept up with you when I was your age." The corners of Otis's mouth twitched as if he were fighting back a smile. "Really?" he asked, his tone skeptical but curious. "Really," Aidan confirmed. "I wasn't half as coordinated as you are." Before Otis could respond, the coach approached, his clipboard tucked under one arm. "Hi there," the man said, eyeing Aidan curiously. "You're not a face I recognize." "I'm Aidan," he said, extending a hand. "I'm a friend of Otis's mom." The coach nodded, shaking his hand briefly. "Nice to meet you. Otis is one of our best players. Always gives it his all." Aidan smiled, glancing at the boy, who was now staring intently at the ground. "I can see that," he said softly. As the coach moved on to address another parent, Aidan turned back to Otis. "Do you need a ride home?" he asked. Otis shook his head. "Mum's coming to get me," he said quietly, then hesitated. "But you can wait with me, if you want." Aidan's chest tightened at the boy's tentative offer, a small but significant step toward trust. "I'd like that," he said, settling onto the bench beside Otis. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the distant sound of other children's chatter filling the gaps. Aidan glanced over at Otis, who was absently fiddling with the hem of his jersey. He seemed to be working up the courage to say something, his small brows furrowing in thought. "Do you like soccer?" Otis finally asked, his voice quiet but curious. Aidan smiled at the question, grateful for the opportunity to bridge the growing gap. "I do," he said. "I used to play a little when I was your age, though I wasn't as good as you." Otis tilted his head slightly, a small grin forming. "Were you really bad?" "Oh, terrible," Aidan said with a chuckle. "I tripped over the ball more times than I care to admit. My coach used to say I had more energy than aim." The boy laughed at that, the sound bright and infectious. For a moment, the tension between them eased, replaced by the simple joy of shared humor. Aidan felt a flicker of hope. This was a beginning, however small. "Do you work with robots?" Otis asked, his tone shifting to one of genuine interest. Aidan's eyes lit up at the question. "I do," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I help design them and figure out how they can make life easier for people. Do you like robots?" Otis nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, I made one out of Legos. It doesn't move, but it looks really cool." "I'd love to see it sometime," Aidan said, meaning it. "Maybe I could show you how to build one that moves." Otis's eyes widened at the suggestion, and Aidan could see the gears turning in his mind. But just as quickly, the boy's excitement seemed to dim, his expression becoming more cautious. "Mom says we have to be careful," he said softly. "She doesn't like me talking to strangers." Aidan's heart ached at the boy's words, but he kept his expression calm. "Your mum is right to say that," he said gently. "She loves you very much and wants to keep you safe." Otis nodded but didn't respond, his gaze drifting back to the field. Aidan let the silence linger, sensing that the boy needed time to process. He wanted to say more, to reassure Otis that he wasn't just some stranger passing through his life, but he knew those words had to come at their own pace. A car pulled up at the edge of the lot, and Aidan recognized Stella's familiar silhouette behind the wheel. She stepped out, scanning the field until her eyes landed on them. Her expression was unreadable as she approached, though Aidan didn't miss the way her gaze softened when it fell on Otis. "Hey, sweetheart," Stella said, crouching down to ruffle Otis's hair. "Did you have a good practice?" Otis nodded, smiling. "Mr. Turner, Aidan, watch me play," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of pride and uncertainty. Stella straightened, her eyes flicking to Aidan. "Did he?" she asked, her tone neutral. "I hope that's okay," Aidan said quickly. "I just wanted to see him in action." Stella studied him for a moment before nodding. "We're heading home," she said, taking Otis's hand. "Thanks for stopping by." Aidan caught the hesitation in her voice but chose not to press. Instead, he smiled at Otis. "I'll see you soon, okay?" "Okay," Otis said, waving as Stella led him toward the car. Aidan watched them go, the ache of longing settling in his chest once more. But beneath it was something else, a quiet determination. He had seen a glimpse of what could be, and he wasn't going to give up. As the car disappeared down the street, Aidan turned back toward his own, already thinking of the next steps he would take to prove himself. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond business or success. This wasn't just about Otis anymore. It was about earning a place in the life of the boy who had already begun to change his world. Aidan stood at the edge of the elementary school gymnasium, the faint sounds of laughter and chatter echoing off the walls. The school was hosting a family night, a casual event, filled with games, crafts, and activities designed to bring students and their families together. He had learned about the event from the school calendar Stella had reluctantly shared with him earlier that week, a small but meaningful step in his slow journey toward inclusion in Otis's life. The gym was alive with energy, Children running from one station to another, parents chatting in small groups, and teachers supervising the organized chaos. Aidan scanned the room, searching for a familiar face. He spotted Otis near the craft table, his small hands busy assembling what looked like a robot from paper and pipe cleaners. A sense of pride swelled in Aidan's chest as he watched the boy work, his brow furrowed in concentration. As he approached, Otis looked up and spotted him, his face lighting up with recognition. "Aidan!" the boy called, waving him over. Aidan smiled, stepping closer. "Hey, Otis, what are you working on?" "It's a robot," Otis said excitedly, holding up the partially constructed figure. "But it's not done yet. I still need to add arms and a face." "Well, it's looking great so far," Aidan said, crouching beside the table. "Do you need any help?" Otis hesitated, glancing at the pile of craft supplies in front of him. "Maybe you can help with the arms. They need to be strong so they don't fall off." Aidan chuckled. "Strong arms it is," he said, reaching for a pair of sturdy pipe cleaners. As they worked together, Aidan marveled at how natural it felt, this small act of collaboration, of being part of something Otis cared about. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Careful," Otis said as Aidan twisted the pipe cleaners into place. "They have to look like robot arms, not spaghetti." Aidan grinned. "Got it. No spaghetti arms." As they finished attaching the arms, a shadow fell over the table, and Aidan looked up to see Stella standing there, her expression a mix of surprise and cautious approval. "You're here," she said, her tone more neutral than accusatory. "I thought I'd stop by," Aidan replied, standing to face her. "I hope that's okay." Stella glanced at Otis, who was now enthusiastically adding googly eyes to his robot. "He seems happy to see you," she said after a pause. Aidan nodded, his voice soft. "That's all I want, Stella, to be here for him." Stella studied him for a moment before nodding slightly. "We'll see," she said, the familiar phrase holding both caution and a flicker of possibility. Before either of them could say more, a man approached the table. He was tall, with an easy smile and a confident presence. "Stella," he said warmly, his gaze flicking briefly to Aidan before settling on her. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "David," Stella said, her tone shifting to one of polite familiarity. "Otis wanted to come, so here we are." David's eyes lingered on Aidan for a moment, his expression unreadable. "And this is?" he asked, his voice measured. "Aidan," Stella said, a note of tension creeping into her voice. "Otis's father." David raised an eyebrow, his smile fading slightly. "Ah," he said simply, his tone cool. "Nice to meet you." "Likewise," Aidan replied, extending a hand. David hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking it, his grip firm. The tension between the two men was palpable, though neither said anything overtly hostile. Aidan could sense the protective edge in David's demeanor, the unspoken challenge in his gaze. It was clear he was someone Stella trusted, and that trust didn't extend to Aidan. Not yet. David's hand dropped to his side, his eyes flicking briefly toward Otis, who was now engrossed in decorating his robot's face. The momentary silence between the adults felt heavy, laden with unspoken questions and quiet judgments. Aidan held his ground, refusing to let David's subtle scrutiny shake him. "So," David said, crossing his arms casually, though his tone was anything but. "What brings you here tonight, Aidan? Family night doesn't exactly seem like your scene." "I'm here for Otis," Aidan replied evenly. "I want to be part of his life." David's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's a big step for someone who's been absent." "David," Stella said sharply, a warning note in her voice. Aidan didn't flinch. "You're right," he said, meeting David's gaze steadily. "I wasn't there before, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." David raised an eyebrow, clearly unprepared for Aidan's directness. Before he could respond, Otis looked up from the table, holding his finished robot aloft with both hands. "Look, Mommy, it's done," he said, beaming with pride. Stella's face softened as she crouched beside him. "Wow, Otis, that's amazing," she said, examining the robot. "You did a great job." "Aiden helped me with the arms," Otis added, glancing over at him with a shy smile. Stella hesitated, her gaze shifting to Aiden. For a moment, her expression was unreadable, but then she nodded. "It's very creative. You both make a good team." Aiden felt a flicker of warmth at her words, small as they were. It wasn't much, but it was a step forward. The atmosphere eased slightly as Otis launched into a detailed explanation of his robot's features, his small hands gesturing animatedly as he spoke. Aiden listened intently, nodding along and asking questions that made the boy's eyes light up. Even Stella seemed to relax, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she watched them interact. David, however, remained on the periphery, his arms still crossed as he observed the scene with a guarded expression. When Otis finally finished his enthusiastic monologue, David cleared his throat, drawing Stella's attention. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked, his tone low but firm. Stella glanced at Aiden, then back at David. "Sure," she said, straightening. She turned to Otis. "Sweetheart, stay here with Aiden, okay? I'll be right back." Otis nodded, turning back to his robot. Stella followed David a few steps away, her expression shifting to one of quiet defensiveness as they spoke in hushed tones. Aiden couldn't hear the words, but he could guess the gist of their conversation, David questioning his presence, Stella defending her cautious decision to let him in. Meanwhile, Aiden sat down beside Otis, his focus shifting back to the boy. "So, what's your robot's name?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Otis said, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "I think I'll call him Bolt." "Bolt," Aiden repeated, nodding approvingly. "That's a strong name. I like it." "Yeah, because he's super fast," Otis explained, holding the robot out in front of him. "And really smart, too." "Sounds like someone I know," Aiden said with a smile, ruffling the boy's hair gently. Otis giggled, his earlier shyness fading with each passing moment. When Stella and David returned, the tension was still palpable, but Stella's expression was resolute. David gave Aiden a curt nod before excusing himself, his gaze lingering on Stella for a beat longer than necessary. As he walked away, Stella turned back to Aiden, her arms crossing over her chest. "David's protective," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "He's been there for us when I didn't have anyone else." "I can see that," Aiden said, keeping his voice steady. "And I don't blame him for wanting to look out for you and Otis. I'd do the same." Stella's eyes flicked to Otis, who was now engrossed in making Bolt perform a clumsy dance across the table. She sighed softly. "He's important to Otis," she said. "But so are you, Aiden. If you're serious about this, you need to show me that you're here for the long haul." "I will," Aiden promised. "Whatever it takes." Stella studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We'll see," she said, her tone softening just slightly. "For now, let's just take it one step at a time." Aiden nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. It wasn't much, but it was a chance, and he intended to make the most of it. As the evening wound down, Aiden lingered near the door, watching as Stella and Otis gathered their things. Before they left, Otis turned back to wave at him, a wide grin on his face. Aiden waved back, a quiet determination filling him as he watched them walk away. This wasn't just about earning Stella's trust or building a bond with Otis. It was about becoming the man they both deserved, and Aiden was ready for the challenge ahead. Aiden adjusted his tie as he stood outside the modest school auditorium, the murmur of voices and laughter filtering through the open doors. Tonight was Otis's art showcase, a school event where students presented their projects to their families. Aidan had learned about it from Stella, who had mentioned it casually during one of their recent conversations. Though her tone had been neutral, the implicit invitation was clear, and Aidan wasn't about to miss it. As he stepped inside, the atmosphere was warm and lively. Parents clustered around tables filled with drawings, sculptures, and various crafts. The walls were adorned with colourful posters, each one proudly displaying a child's name. Aidan's eyes scanned the room until he spotted Otis standing near his display table, a mixture of excitement and nervousness on his face. Stella was beside him, her presence calm and reassuring as she helped him adjust the arrangement of his work. Aidan approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt. When Otis noticed him, his eyes lit up and he waved eagerly. "Aidan, you came." "Of course I did," Aidan said with a smile, stepping closer. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Otis beamed, his confidence bolstered by Aidan's presence. He motioned toward the table, where a series of drawings and a small motorized sculpture sat prominently on display. "This is my project," he said proudly. "It's a robot that helps with homework." Aidan leaned in to examine the sculpture, a small but intricate creation made from craft materials and simple mechanics. It wasn't functional, but the design was thoughtful and creative. "This is incredible," Aidan said, his admiration genuine. "How did you come up with the idea?" "I thought about what I'd want a robot to do," Otis explained, his voice gaining confidence. "And I thought if it could help with homework, it would save so much time for playing." Aidan laughed. "Smart thinking. I might need one of these for my office." Stella watched the interaction quietly, her expression softening as she observed the easy rapport between Aidan and Otis. She hadn't been sure what to expect when she told Aidan about the showcase, but seeing him here, fully engaged and supportive, made her question her initial reservations. As more parents drifted toward Otis's table to admire his project, Aidan stepped back slightly, giving them space while still keeping an eye on Otis. Stella joined him, her arms crossed loosely as she leaned against the edge of the nearby wall. "He's really proud of this," Stella said, her voice low but warm. "He's been working on it for weeks." "And he should be," Aidan replied. "He's brilliant." Stella glanced at him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You're good with him," she said after a moment. "Better than I expected." Aidan turned to her, his expression serious but gentle. "He makes it easy," he said. "And I mean it, Stella. I want to be here for him, for both of you." Stella didn't respond immediately, her gaze lingering on Otis as he explained his project to a group of parents. "We'll see," she said finally, her tone carrying a hint of vulnerability. Aidan nodded at Stella's words, understanding the weight behind them. He didn't expect immediate trust. He knew he had a long road ahead to prove himself. But seeing the small, hesitant shifts in her demeanor gave him hope. She wasn't shutting him out entirely, and that was more than he could have asked for just weeks ago. As the evening progressed, Aidan stayed close but unobtrusive, letting Otis take center stage. The boy was a natural, enthusiastically explaining his project to anyone who stopped by. Aidan caught Stella's eye more than once, and though her expression was measured, he thought he saw a flicker of approval there. The moment of peace, however, was interrupted by a familiar voice. "Well, this is a surprise." Aidan turned to see David approaching, his hands tucked into the pockets of his blazer. His smile was tight, and his gaze flicked briefly to Stella before settling on Aidan. "David," Stella said, her tone polite but tinged with caution. "I didn't know you were coming." "I heard about the showcase from Otis," David replied, his attention shifting to the boy, who was still engaged with a group of parents. "I thought I'd stop by and see his work." Aidan kept his expression neutral, though he could feel the subtle tension radiating from David. It was clear the man wasn't thrilled about his presence, but Aidan wasn't about to let that deter him. He had every right to be here, for Otis. David turned back to Stella, his voice dropping slightly. "Can I speak to you for a moment?" Stella hesitated, glancing briefly at Aidan. "Sure," she said, stepping away with David to a quieter corner of the room. Aidan watched them go, his jaw tightening as he caught the way David leaned in, his posture protective. Aidan forced himself to take a deep breath, reminding himself that this wasn't about him. It was about Otis and Stella, and building trust, no matter how long it took. "Are you okay?" Aidan looked down to see Otis standing beside him, his small face scrunched with concern. "You looked mad," the boy said, tilting his head. Aidan crouched slightly, meeting Otis's gaze. "I'm not mad," he said gently. "I was just thinking. How are you feeling? Are you having fun?" Otis nodded quickly. "Yeah, lots of people like my robot." "They should," Aidan said with a smile. "It's amazing, just like you." Otis grinned at the compliment, his earlier concern melting away. "Do you think I could make a real one someday? Like a robot that actually works?" "Absolutely," Aidan said without hesitation. "And if you ever need help, you know where to find me." The boy's smile widened, and he nodded. "Okay." At that moment, Stella and David returned. Stella's expression was unreadable, but David's was decidedly cooler. Aidan straightened, meeting the man's gaze head-on. "Otis," David said, his tone softer as he crouched down beside the boy, "your project is amazing. I'm really proud of you." "Thanks, Uncle David," Otis said brightly. The words hit Aidan like a quiet blow, but he kept his expression steady. Of course, David had been a presence in Otis's life when he hadn't. It stung, but Aidan knew he couldn't let it show. Not now. As the event began winding down, parents and children started gathering their things, and Otis reluctantly packed up his project. Aidan helped him carry the robot to Stella's car, earning a small but appreciative nod from her. Before they left, Otis turned to Aidan. "Will I see you again soon?" Aidan crouched beside him, his voice steady and warm. "You will," he promised. "Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." Otis grinned, and for the first time, Stella didn't look away. She met Aidan's gaze directly, her expression softer than it had been all night. "Good night, Aidan," she said quietly as she opened the car door. "Good night," he replied, stepping back as they drove away. He stood there for a long moment, watching the taillights fade into the distance. The road ahead was still uncertain, but tonight had been a victory, small perhaps, but meaningful. Aidan walked back to his car with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for a place in Otis's life anymore. He was fighting for a family and for the chance to prove he was worthy of it. The conference room buzzed with energy as the Turner Technologies leadership team prepared for the press conference. Aidan stood near the podium, his thoughts racing as he flipped through the notes in his hand. This event was meant to highlight the company's latest community outreach initiative, a project he had been deeply involved in. But today, his mind was elsewhere, burdened by something far more personal. The night before, Aidan had received an email from Sophia with an attachment he had been dreading, a draft of an article from a prominent local journalist. The headline alone had made his stomach drop. "Behind the Billionaire, the Secret Family of Aidan Turner." The journalist, none other than Lila Carter, had pieced together enough information to create a compelling narrative. There were no explicit accusations, but the tone suggested a scandal, one that could potentially jeopardize both Aidan's personal progress and his professional reputation. Worse still, the article prominently featured Otis, his name, his school, even a photograph taken at the art showcase. Aidan had stared at the photo, his heart pounding with a mix of rage and panic. This wasn't just about him, it was about Otis, and the boy didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire. "Are you ready?" Sophia's voice pulled him back to the present. Aidan looked up, meeting her concerned gaze. She was standing beside him, a clipboard in hand. "As ready as I'll ever be," he muttered, tucking the notes into his pocket. Sophia lowered her voice. "We can still cancel this if you think it's too risky." "No," Aidan said firmly. "If I cancel, it'll only fuel the fire. I need to address this, on my terms." She nodded, her expression tight. "Just remember, you don't owe anyone the details of your personal life. Stick to the initiative. If anyone brings up the article, redirect." "Got it," Aidan said, though his resolve felt dry. As the press conference began, Aidan delivered his opening remarks with practiced ease, outlining the goals and potential impact of Turner Technologies' latest project. He fielded the initial questions from reporters smoothly, his answers polished and confident. But he knew it was only a matter of time before someone brought up the article. Sure enough, midway through the Q&A, a hand shot up from the back of the room. It was Lila Carter. Her expression was sharp, her notepad poised as she stood to address him. "Mr. Turner," she began, her voice carrying a calculated mixture of politeness and steel. "While your commitment to community programs is admirable, there's been some speculation recently about your personal life, specifically about your connection to a young boy named Otis. Would you care to comment?" A hush fell over the room, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Aidan's grip tightened on the edge of the podium, his heart hammering in his chest. He glanced briefly at Sophia, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Aidan met Lila's gaze head-on. "I'm glad you asked," he said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, I have a personal connection to Otis. He's my son." The room erupted in murmurs, a wave of whispered speculation spreading through the gathered reporters like wildfire. Cameras flashed, and pens scratched furiously across notepads. Aidan stood tall, his face calm despite the storm brewing around him. He had anticipated this moment, and while it hadn't come on his terms, he was determined to take control of the narrative. "I've spent much of my life focused on building my company and chasing success," Aidan continued, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But in doing so, I lost sight of what truly matters. Recently, I've been given the opportunity to reconnect with my son and his incredible mother. It's not a journey without challenges, but it's one I'm fully committed to." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. The reporters hung on his every word, sensing the rare vulnerability in a man known for his stoic professionalism. Lila raised her hand again, her expression unreadable. "Are you saying you've only recently taken an active role in your son's life?" "That's correct," Aidan said, his honesty unwavering. "I wasn't there for Otis in the beginning, and that's a mistake I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and I'm doing everything I can to build a meaningful relationship with him." Another reporter chimed in. "How do you think this revelation will impact your reputation, both personally and professionally?" Aidan considered the question carefully before answering. "I'm not concerned about my reputation," he said. "What matters to me is being there for my son and earning the trust of the people I care about. If my personal journey can inspire others to prioritize their families, then that's a consequence I'm proud to accept." The murmurs grew softer, the room beginning to shift from a tone of interrogation to one of cautious respect. Aidan could feel the tide turning, but he knew the real challenge was yet to come. He wasn't just speaking to the reporters in front of him. He was sending a message to Stella and Otis, hoping they would understand the sincerity behind his words. When the press conference concluded, Aidan stepped away from the podium, a sense of relief washing over him. Sophia was waiting in the wings, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. "You handled that well," she said, handing him a bottle of water. "But you know this is just the beginning, right?" "I do," Aidan said, taking a sip. "But at least now it's out in the open." Sophia hesitated before speaking again. "Do you think Stella will see it that way?" Aidan's chest tightened at the question. He had tried to protect Stella and Otis from the scrutiny of his public life, but now their connection was out there for the world to dissect. "I'll talk to her," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I owe her that much." Later that evening, Aidan stood outside Stella's apartment building, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. He knocked gently, the sound echoing in the stillness of the hallway. When the door opened, Stella's expression was guarded, her arms crossed as she regarded him. "You went public," she said, her tone flat. "I didn't have a choice," Aidan said, his voice calm. "The story was going to come out whether I wanted it to or not. I thought it was better if I told the truth." "And dragged us into the spotlight in the process?" Stella's eyes flashed with frustration. "Do you have any idea what this could mean for Otis? For me?" Aidan stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "I did it to protect you. I wanted to control the narrative before someone else could twist it." Stella shook her head, her expression a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "You think you can control everything, Aidan, but this isn't just about you. It's about Otis. He didn't ask for any of this." "I know," Aidan said, his voice breaking slightly. "And I'm sorry. I'm trying to do the right thing, Stella. I'm trying to make up for all the years I wasn't there." Her gaze softened slightly, but her walls didn't come down entirely. "This doesn't make it easier," she said quietly. "If anything, it makes it harder. But I appreciate that you were honest." Aidan nodded, sensing the fragile balance in her tone. "I meant what I said today," he said. "I'm not going anywhere, for Otis and for you." Stella didn't respond immediately, her eyes searching his face for something unspoken. Finally, she sighed, stepping aside to let him in. "Come in, Aidan," she said. "We need to talk." As the door closed behind him, Aidan felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a chance to rebuild, step by step. Aidan stood on the sidewalk outside Stella's apartment building, the faint warmth of the spring sun on his back doing little to soothe his nerves. He glanced at the small gift bag in his hand, its contents carefully chosen, a set of art supplies Otis had been eyeing during their last outing. It wasn't extravagant, but it was thoughtful, something that reflected how closely Aidan had been paying attention. Today, he wasn't just here to drop off a gift. Stella had finally agreed to a small family outing, a visit to the local science museum. It wasn't a monumental step, but it felt significant to Aidan, a sign that Stella was beginning to believe in his commitment. He knew better than to take it for granted. The sound of the apartment door opening pulled him from his thoughts. Stella and Otis emerged, Stella carrying a bag slung over her shoulder, while Otis held a well-worn notebook filled with sketches and doodles. Aidan smiled, crouching slightly to meet Otis's excited gaze. "Ready for the big adventure?" Aidan asked, his tone warm. "Yeah," Otis said, bouncing on his heels. "Do you think they'll have robots at the museum?" "I'm pretty sure they will," Aidan replied, "and maybe we can even see how they work." Otis's eyes widened with excitement, and he turned to Stella. "Mum, can we?" Stella's smile was faint, but genuine. "We'll see," she said, glancing at Aidan. "Let's get going." The drive to the museum was filled with Otis's chatter, the boy's enthusiasm lighting up the car. Aidan listened intently, occasionally chiming in with questions or comments that kept the conversation flowing. Stella remained quieter, her gaze often fixed out the window, but Aidan caught her watching them in the rearview mirror more than once. When they arrived, the museum's grand entrance loomed before them, its glass facade reflecting the bustling city around it. Inside, the air buzzed with energy as families and school groups explored the exhibits. Otis darted ahead, his excitement barely contained as he pulled Aidan and Stella toward the robotics section. The exhibit was a marvel, rows of interactive displays showcasing the latest advancements in technology. Otis's face lit up as he explored each station, his small hands eagerly pressing buttons and manipulating controls. Aidan stayed close, guiding him through the more complex demonstrations, while Stella observed from a few steps back. At one point, Otis stopped in front of a display featuring a robotic arm assembling small models. "I want to make something like that one day," he said, his voice filled with determination. "You can," Aidan said, crouching beside him. "It takes practice and learning, but you're already on your way." "Really?" Otis asked, his eyes shining. "Absolutely," Aidan replied, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "And I'll be here to help you every step of the way." For a moment, Otis stared at him, his expression thoughtful. Then he smiled, a bright, unguarded grin that made Aidan's chest tighten with emotion. The robotics exhibit gave way to a section showcasing space exploration, and Otis's enthusiasm showed no signs of slowing. He tugged at Aidan's sleeve, pointing toward a model of a Mars rover. "Can we look at that one next?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. "Lead the way," Aidan said with a smile, following as Otis darted toward the display. As Otis eagerly examined the rover, Aidan found himself standing beside Stella, who had remained quietly observant for most of the visit. Her expression was softer now, though her guarded demeanor hadn't entirely faded. "He's really happy," Stella said, her voice low enough that only Aidan could hear. "I haven't seen him this excited in a while." "He's an amazing kid," Aidan replied, his tone sincere. "It's easy to see why he's so special." Stella glanced at him, her lips pressing into a thin line as she seemed to weigh her words. "I can see you're trying, Aidan," she said finally, "and Otis is clearly responding to you, but it's still a lot for me to process." "I understand," Aidan said gently. "I don't expect this to happen overnight. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Stella nodded slowly, her expression softening further. "It means a lot to him, to both of us, that you're making the effort." Before Aidan could respond, Otis bounded back toward them, his notebook in hand. "Look, Mum," he said, flipping to a page filled with sketches of robots and rockets. "I'm going to build a rover like that one day." "I don't doubt it," Stella said, her voice warm as she crouched to examine his drawings. "You've got the imagination and the determination. And maybe Aidan can help me," Otis added, glancing between the two adults. "He knows a lot about robots." Stella hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Maybe he can," she said, her tone carefully measured. The words were small, but they felt monumental to Aidan. It wasn't a full endorsement, but it was a step toward the trust he was working so hard to earn. As the afternoon wore on, the three of them continued exploring the museum together. Aidan let Otis set the pace, following his lead as they moved from one exhibit to the next. Stella stayed close, occasionally offering quiet comments or answering Otis's endless stream of questions. By the time they returned to the car, Otis was practically vibrating with excitement, recounting every detail of the visit, as if he hadn't just experienced it. Aidan couldn't help but smile as he listened, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude. As they pulled up to Stella's apartment building, Otis turned to Aidan, his expression earnest. "Can we do this again sometime?" he asked. Aidan nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion welling inside him. Absolutely, he said. Anytime you want. Otis grinned, and Stella offered Aidan a small but genuine smile as she unbuckled her seatbelt. Thank you for today, she said quietly. It meant a lot to him. It meant a lot to me too, Aidan replied. As they disappeared into the building, Aidan sat in the car for a moment, reflecting on the day. For the first time, he felt like he was beginning to build something real, a connection, a family, and he was determined to protect it at all costs. The shrill sound of a phone ringing cut through Aidan's focus as he sat at his office desk, reviewing the latest projections for a company project. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing slightly when Stella's name appeared. She rarely called him directly, and his pulse quickened as he picked up. "Stella?" he said, his voice calm but laced with concern. Her voice on the other end was tight, her words rushed. "It's Otis. He had an accident at school." Aidan immediately straightened in his chair, his grip tightening on the phone. "What happened? Is he okay?" "He's at the hospital," she replied, her tone shaking slightly. "He fell during recess, hit his head. They're running tests now to make sure it's nothing serious." "I'm on my way," Aidan said without hesitation, already reaching for his jacket. "Which hospital?" She gave him the name, and before she could say more, he was out the door, his mind racing. The drive to the hospital was a blur, his usually steady demeanor replaced by a gnawing sense of urgency. Images of Otis's bright smile and boundless energy filled his mind, making the thought of him hurt or scared almost unbearable. When Aidan arrived at the hospital, he hurried through the entrance, scanning the waiting area until he spotted Stella. She was sitting in a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her usual composure replaced by an expression of worry that made his chest ache. "Stella," he called softly, approaching her. She looked up, her relief visible even as she maintained her guarded demeanor. "They're still running tests," she said, standing. "They think it's just a concussion, but they want to be sure." Aidan nodded, his eyes scanning the hallway, as though willing someone to bring him news. "Where is he? Can I see him?" "They're monitoring him for now," Stella said, her voice quieter. "They'll let us in as soon as they finish." For a moment the two of them stood in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Aidan finally sank into the chair beside her, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared at the floor. "I should have been there," he muttered, his voice low. Stella glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "You couldn't have known this would happen," she said softly. "It's not your fault." Aidan shook his head, his hands running through his hair. I hate the thought of him being hurt. He's such a bright, curious kid. He doesn't deserve this." "No one does," Stella agreed, her voice wavering slightly. "But he's strong, Aidan. He'll be okay." The quiet assurance in her tone steadied him, and for the first time since receiving her call, he allowed himself to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor finally emerged into the waiting area. Both Aidan and Stella stood immediately, their movements almost synchronized as they approached him. "Mr. and Mrs. Turner?" the doctor asked, glancing between them. Stella hesitated, but Aidan stepped forward without missing a beat. "Yes," he said firmly. "How is Otis?" The doctor offered a reassuring smile. "He's doing well. The CT scan confirmed there's no serious injury, just a mild concussion. We're going to keep him under observation for a few more hours to be safe, but he's awake and asking for you." Aidan felt the tension in his chest ease slightly, the words "he's awake" acting as a balm to his frayed nerves. Stella's shoulders visibly relaxed, and she let out a breath she'd been holding. "Can we see him?" she asked. "Of course," the doctor replied, motioning for them to follow him. "Just keep things calm and quiet for now. He's a little groggy, but in good spirits." They walked down the hallway together, the sterile smell of the hospital surrounding them. When they reached Otis's room, Aidan hesitated for a fraction of a second, letting Stella step in first. The sight of Otis sitting up in bed, his small frame dwarfed by the crisp white sheets, made Aidan's heart clench. "Mom," Otis said, his voice slightly raspy but filled with relief. "Hi." Stella was by his side in an instant, gently brushing his hair back as she checked him over with a mother's practiced eye. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly. "How are you feeling?" "Okay," Otis replied, though his expression turned sheepish. "My head hurts a little." "That's because you gave it a good knock," Aidan said, stepping closer. "You had us worried, buddy." Otis's eyes lit up when he saw Aidan, though there was a flicker of guilt there too. "I didn't mean to fall," he said, his voice small. "Of course you didn't," Aidan replied, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "Accidents happen. The important thing is that you're okay." Otis nodded, his fingers fidgeting with the blanket. "I was running to catch the ball and my foot slipped. It was dumb." "It wasn't dumb," Stella said firmly. "It was an accident. And you're going to be just fine." Otis's gaze shifted between the two of them, his expression softening. "You both came," he said after a moment, his voice tinged with wonder. "Of course we did," Aidan said, his tone gentle but unwavering. "We're your parents. We'll always be here when you need us." The words seemed to sink in, and Otis smiled, a quiet, contented smile that made every ounce of worry worth it. Aidan glanced at Stella, who met his gaze briefly before nodding, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They spent the next hour sitting with Otis, taking turns answering his questions and assuring him that he'd be back to running around in no time. When the doctor returned to give the all-clear for discharge, Stella and Aidan worked together seamlessly, helping Otis get ready to leave. As they walked out of the hospital, Otis holding both their hands, Aidan felt a quiet sense of triumph. This was what he had been fighting for. Not just a place in Otis's life, but moments like these, where they could face challenges together as a family. Aidan stood in the middle of his penthouse living room, carefully arranging the photographs and sketches he had spent the past few weeks gathering. The space, usually immaculate and stark, was now filled with splashes of color and creativity, photos of Otis's art projects, snapshots from their museum visit, and candid pictures of Stella and Otis together. In the center of it all was a custom-made scrapbook, its cover embossed with Otis's name. This wasn't just a gesture, it was a declaration. Aidan had poured himself into creating something tangible that reflected his growing connection with Otis and his desire to be a real part of his life. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he hoped this would show both Stella and Otis that he was serious about building a future together. As he stepped back to assess his work, the intercom buzzed, signaling Stella's arrival. He took a deep breath, wiping his hands on his jeans before pressing the button. "Come on up." A few moments later, Stella and Otis walked through the door. Otis's eyes widened as he took in the display, a mix of curiosity and excitement lighting up his face. "What's all this?" he asked, looking up at Aidan. "It's for you," Aidan said, crouching to Otis's level. "I wanted to show you something I've been working on. Come take a look." Otis didn't need to be asked twice. He darted over to the table, his small hands running over the photographs and drawings. "That's my robot," he exclaimed, pointing to a picture from the school showcase. "And that's us at the museum." Stella lingered near the doorway, her expression unreadable as she watched Otis examine the display. Aidan glanced at her, his stomach knotting with a mix of nerves and hope. "I thought it might be nice to put all these moments together," he said, "to remind us of everything we've been building." "It's thoughtful," Stella said, her tone guarded but not dismissive. Otis picked up the scrapbook, flipping through the pages with growing excitement. "This is so cool," he said, turning to show Stella. "Look, Mum, there's a picture of me drawing robots." Stella stepped closer, her gaze softening as she took in the carefully arranged pages. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, her fingers brushing over one of the photographs. "I wanted to give Otis something he could look back on," Aidan said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "And I wanted to show you both how much this means to me." Stella's eyes met his, and for a moment the room felt charged with unspoken words. Aidan held her gaze, hoping she could see the sincerity in his expression. He wasn't just trying to win her over. He was trying to prove he could be the man she and Otis deserved. Otis continued flipping through the scrapbook, pausing at nearly every page to point out something he recognized. "This is when we went to the Science Museum," he exclaimed, holding up a page that featured a photo of him standing in front of the Mars rover exhibit, beaming with pride. "And look, you even got my sketches in here." Aidan smiled, crouching beside him. "Of course I did. Your drawings are amazing, Otis. They deserve to be front and center." Otis's grin widened, but then his expression turned thoughtful. He looked up at Aidan, his small hands clutching the edges of the scrapbook. "Why did you make this?" Aidan hesitated for a moment, glancing briefly at Stella before focusing on Otis. "Because you're important to me," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I wanted you to have something that shows how much I care about the time we've spent together, and how much I look forward to spending more time with you." Otis stared at him for a long moment, his eyes wide and searching. Then, without a word, he leaned forward and wrapped his arms around Aidan's neck in a hug that was both sudden and fierce. Aidan froze for a fraction of a second before hugging him back, his throat tightening with emotion. Stella watched the exchange, her arms loosely crossed over her chest. She didn't say anything, but the softening of her features spoke volumes. Aidan met her gaze over Otis's shoulder, silently willing her to see how much this moment meant to him. When Otis finally pulled back, his cheeks were flushed, and he was still clutching the scrapbook tightly. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice filled with sincerity. "You're welcome, buddy," Aidan replied, ruffling his hair gently. "I'm glad you like it." Otis turned to Stella, holding up the scrapbook for her to see. "Mum, isn't this the best?" Stella smiled, the kind of smile that was rare and genuine, and Aidan felt a flicker of hope in his chest. "It's pretty great," she said, brushing a hand lightly over Otis's hair. Aidan put a lot of thought into it. The three of them lingered by the table, the tension that had so often defined their interactions noticeably absent. Stella eventually moved to one of the photos pinned to the wall, a candid shot of Otis laughing during their museum visit. She traced the edge of the frame with her finger, her expression soft but contemplative. "This means a lot to him," she said quietly, not turning to face Aidan. "To both of us." Aidan stepped closer, keeping his voice low so only she could hear. "I meant what I said, Stella. I'm in this for the long haul. I know it won't undo the past, but I hope it can be the foundation for the future." Stella turned to face him, her eyes searching his. For a moment, the guarded walls she had built seemed to waver, and Aidan could see the conflict and hope battling within her. "You're starting to prove that," she said finally, "but it's going to take more than a scrapbook." "I know," Aidan said, his voice soft but resolute. "And I'm ready to do the work, whatever it takes." Stella nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. "We'll see," she said. But this time, the words carried less doubt and more possibility. As the evening wound down, Aidan walked them to the elevator, Otis still clutching the scrapbook as if it were a prized treasure. When the doors closed, Aidan stood in the empty hallway for a long moment, a rare sense of contentment settling over him. For the first time, he truly felt like he was building something real, a connection, a family, and the trust he had spent so long fighting for. And though he knew the journey wasn't over, he was more determined than ever to see it through. The auditorium buzzed with quiet anticipation as families and friends settled into their seats. Aidan adjusted his tie nervously, glancing down at the program in his hands. Tonight was Otis's school assembly, a culmination of weeks of hard work by the students. It wasn't a grand affair, but to Aidan, it felt monumental. This was the first time he would be attending something as part of Otis's life, not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who belonged. He caught sight of Stella a few rows ahead, helping Otis with his costume. The boy was dressed as a tiny inventor, complete with a makeshift lab coat and goggles. Aidan smiled at the sight, his chest swelling with pride. Over the past few months, they had found a rhythm, an unspoken understanding that allowed them to move forward as a family. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but they were learning to trust each other in ways Aidan hadn't thought possible. When the lights dimmed, the audience hushed, and the first group of students took the stage. Aidan leaned forward slightly, searching for Otis in the lineup. When it was his turn, Otis stepped forward confidently, holding a small model of the robot he had designed as part of the class project. He spoke clearly, explaining how the robot would help with household tasks and make life easier for families. As Otis finished, the audience clapped enthusiastically, and Aidan couldn't help but join in, his applause loud and heartfelt. He caught Otis's eye for a brief moment, and the boy's face lit up with a grin that made Aidan's heart soar. Stella glanced back as well, her expression soft, and Aidan nodded at her, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come. As the assembly concluded, parents and children spilled into the hallway, their voices filling the space with excitement and laughter. Aidan made his way through the crowd, his eyes fixed on Otis and Stella, who were standing near the display table showcasing the students' projects. Otis was animatedly talking to his teacher, his small hands gesturing as he explained the finer points of his robot design. When Aidan reached them, Otis turned, his face lighting up. "Did you see me, Aidan?" "I didn't mess up." "You were incredible," Aidan said, crouching down to Otis's level. "Your presentation was perfect and your robot is amazing. I'm so proud of you." Otis beamed, his confidence glowing. "Thanks. Mum helped me practice a lot." "She did a great job," Aidan said, glancing up at Stella, who smiled faintly, her eyes warm. As the teacher moved on to speak with other parents, Otis tugged at Aidan's sleeve. "Can we celebrate? Maybe with ice cream?" Aidan laughed, glancing at Stella for confirmation. "What do you think?" he asked. "Ice cream sounds like the perfect way to celebrate to me." Stella chuckled softly, her posture relaxing. "I think we've earned it." The three of them walked out into the cool evening air, Otis chatting excitedly between them. Aidan felt a deep sense of contentment, a feeling that had eluded him for years. This wasn't just a moment, it was a culmination of everything they had worked toward, a family built on trust, forgiveness, and hope. As they reached the car, Otis looked up at Aidan, his eyes bright. "Do you think one day I can build a real robot that helps people?" "I don't just think it," Aidan said, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I know you can, and I'll be there every step of the way." Stella smiled at Aidan over Otis's head, a quiet but profound acknowledgement of the man he had become. Aidan smiled back, feeling a sense of closure and a sense of beginning. They drove off into the night, their laughter filling the car as they headed toward the ice cream shop. For the first time in a long time, Aidan felt truly at home, not in a place, but with the people who mattered most.